Well, welcome everybody. I'm Jens Hilke, a conservation biologist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And also with me is Dave Maroney, who will take over for the second half of the presentation, also with the Community Wildlife Program at Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And today we want to talk a little bit more about understanding Vermont conservation design and differentiating the design from BioFinder and explaining a little bit more about what the design entails. And let's see if I can actually advance my slides. Yes. So you've already passed the first test and joined Microsoft Teams. It seems to be a constantly shifting target for us in terms of using Teams, but thank you so much for sticking with us. If you would please mute your microphones during the presentation, that would be great. There's going to be time for questions and answers, and you can do that through the chat while we're talking, or we'll also be able to unmute your mics. So right now, if you would just practice using the chat, that would be awesome. And introduce yourselves, please, your name and what town you're from or what organization you're with. That would be great. And feel free to write questions while we're talking, and we'll take a break every about 10 or 15 slides and address those questions at that time. It's also, the chat is also where we'll put resources for you while we're talking. And so that's a real opportunity to get a little bit more of the background documentation. Dave and I work for Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and we believe in the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. We staff the Community Wildlife Program and supply technical assistance to Vermont towns. We've certainly worked a lot in Shrewsbury, where a couple of the participants are from today, and I've spent some time in working with Ripton and Middlebury as well. So it's great to have you all with us, but our services are free, and there are a wide range of technical assistance offerings. So the first thing I'd like to begin with is really thinking about why, and that big picture of why we created VCD, Vermont Conservation Design, and then think a little bit about what's new in 2024. We'll dive into the components of the design, and then Dave will take over and think more about how you can apply Vermont conservation design in your town and in your work. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll have these pop-ups will come up on the question slides, and so you'll know we'll have 4 different segments today, and we'll have questions after each of them. So before I get too far along, let's just make sure we're on the same page. Vermont Conservation Design is a science-based vision to sustain the state's valued natural areas, forests, waters, wildlife, and plants for future generations. So the VCD is the data, it's the design, it's the big picture prioritization. It answers how much is enough. Where are those important places, and how much of those important places do we need? BioFinder is the website. That's where you access the data. That's where you can interact with the data. That's where you can zoom in to your home or your parcel or your favorite spot and learn more about that ecological context. So there are a few different elements of the design that I really want to talk about. And first, of course, is the extent to which it's a prioritization. Then, or next, is this idea of maintaining nature and its benefits, and then thinking about the design as a conservation framework. So, as we think about maintaining nature and its benefits, well, maintaining an intact, connected, and diverse natural landscape is really critical, not just for maintaining current biological diversity, but also allowing for nature to adapt to a changing climate. And so with this, we get these ecological services, right? These environmental services like clean air and water, carbon sequestration, and flood protection. So the design, we built it as a science project, right? Thinking about current biological diversity and climate resilience into the future. But what it actually captures is so much more than that. Clean air and water and carbon and flood protection, et cetera. So that it really gets at a lot of the services that nature provides, those benefits. It's also a natural climate solution. So as wildlife and plants are readjusting their range in the face of a changing climate, well, the design points to this connected pattern of forests and waters across the state, allowing for climate adaptation and climate resilience. So the design really captures this natural climate solution. Of course, it also captures social and economic values like working farms and forests. In fact, we have to look at the economic drivers of what keeps forest as forest and make sure that those well-managed forests are part of this larger picture. And while that isn't appropriate everywhere, it is part of the picture, and it is, maintaining these well-managed forests and these economic incentives to keep the forest intact is really critical to sustaining the ecologically functional landscape that's envisioned in Vermont conservation design. Of course, the design also captures things like social and economic values. I hear, in the work that I do in towns, I hear a lot about rural character. And I don't love that term. I don't exactly know what it means, but I hear it across Vermont and it resonates with people. And it's part of what makes Vermont, Vermont. And so as we think about the ecological prioritization, well, we're actually talking about more than that. We're talking about social and economic values as well. So I just wanted to start and have this first section really thinking about the why, and really that larger picture of what we're capturing here and why this is so important. It's not just about ecology. It's really about our way of life and our community and our ecology and our economy. Okay, so that's this first section. I doubt there are any questions, but I'll ask Dave, did anything come up in those first few slides?
Nothing posted yet. Welcome, folks. My name is Dave Maroney, Nance's colleague in the Community Wildlife Program. And we have we've got an intimate group here today, which is great. So we can afford to, ask questions directly. But I also want to point your attention to the chat. We really like that feature because if you have any question pop up at any point during one of the presentations and you don't want to, wait or worry about forgetting that question, you can just type it into the chat and I'll monitor those questions and we can bring them up at these breaks and give you an opportunity to ask them directly. So I just want to draw your attention to that. If you have any questions right now, feel free to take yourself off mute or use the raise hand icon at the top of your Teams toolbar. Otherwise, we'll continue on and there'll be more slides like this where you see opportunities for breaks and questions. All right, so I think back to you, Jens. Let's go for section 2.
So what's new? Well, we first started BioFinder in 2011. So this is now the 4th time that we've updated the BioFinder website and the 3rd time we've updated the conservation design. At the heart of the landscape scale data in the conservation design is this concept of the habitat block. It's an area of natural cover surrounded by roads, development, and agriculture. We've mapped them on the scale of 20 acres to 150,000 acres. That's the largest one. On average, they're about 1,000 acres each. And we really first started this concept back in 2011. But I think more than that, conservation has gone from thinking about hotspots, islands in sea of development, to really thinking about a larger pattern. And the use of this unit has really been instrumental for us. Now, when we first started, we were using 30-meter pixels. So the whole state divided up into squares of 30 by 30 each. And then you assess is it part of the forest block or not on that kind of scale. Well, the new version, the 2023 version of the conservation design, the habitat blocks that are incorporated there used a 0.5 meter pixel. So the new VCD has a resolution that is 3,600 times greater than the previous version. In particular, that really allows us to see the edges of the blocks. We have not found any new forests that we didn't know about, but our ability to detect the edges has increased dramatically. So that's really huge, and I'll talk about why that's so important here in a second. But that's the most notable part of the update, is this underlying forest block data and the improvements in its resolution. Let me give you an example. At top is an aerial photo from Goshen. At left is the 2011 version of the forest blocks, or habitat blocks. At right is the 2023. And so you can see that in 2011, we really just took an even buffer around all the roads and removed them from the habitat blocks. It's pretty pixelated. We didn't really have a great ability to detect those edges. By 2023, you can see that there's some sections of the road where we know the habitat block goes right down to the edge. And there are other places where there are habitats where we know, where there are houses where we know that there are impacts because of that housing. And that probably isn't a great spot for road crossings. Here's another example from Waitsfield. And in 2011, you can see just how blocky that is. The development in that version was removed as a density of development. Here in 2023, we really took a buffer around every single 150-foot buffer around every single house. So there's this intuitive display of fragmentation. And again, the better edges really allow us to see the road crossings a lot more clearly than we did before. So the 2023 version has better wetland data. And so you can see that top blue arrow, that area was added because of this better wetland data. I mentioned the intuitive display of fragmentation and the increase in edge. And in this case, that's a good thing. It means that our ability to detect the edge. Now, the input data, LiDAR-derived land cover data, is really based on vegetation height. And that's why we have such a great ability to detect trees. But the open land classes are a little bit worse. And so our ability to detect a recent patch cut versus a front lawn versus a golf course is pretty limited. And in some ways, it's even like guessing what the intention of the landowner is, right? Is this a cut that was part of a forestry operation and is going to come back to tall trees and it is absolutely should be included in the forest? Or is this going to be a new Dollar General? But with the better input data, it's really hard for us to fill those holes, even in places where we know, like permanently conserved land, where we know it's going to return to forest. So there are a few donut holes in the middle of our forest blocks, often related to timber harvest, that I personally wish had been filled. You know, I do think they're going to go back to forest, but we don't have good enough. We don't have data that really tells us what that intention of the landowner is. Similarly, power lines are not included in the habitat block. And as you all may well know, bear, for example, will certainly travel along power lines. They're not going to be developed into subdivision. I would have included them in the forest block, but because of that higher quality input data, they are not included in the blocks. I mentioned this before, but I really want to hammer that this idea of the increase in edge allows us to detect wildlife road crossings better than ever. And so this is really just foundational for our connectivity science. It's such a leap forward in terms of our ability to discern where wildlife are likely to be crossing the roads. Okay, so habitat blocks. That's every forest in Vermont. That's the raw data that's not prioritized. For Vermont conservation design, we took a subset of all of those forest blocks and we prioritized them because of different values like interior forest, connectivity, geological diversity, and I'll explain those components more. But as we build the conservation design, first we take those selections, those subsets of the habitat blocks, right? Those highest priority landscape blocks, okay? Then we add the entire surface water and riparian area network. I'm talking about everything that's wet, all lakes, rivers, ponds, streams, all of it, wetlands. There's additional prioritization in the community species and community scale components for aquatic features. At this first level, it's just everything that's wet is highest priority. So then we're building this map. So then we add in our highest priority natural communities and habitat features. So, the highest ranked natural communities and rare, threatened, and endangered species. And so together, this gives us this ecologically functional landscape. So Vermont conservation design can be thought of as a singular map, a prioritization of all the lands and waters in Vermont that are most important for maintaining ecological function. Later on, we'll explode that map into its component parts. But for now, let's just think of this as a singular map. But I do want to take a moment to think about this idea of ecological function, right? Because we're moving to this landscape scale, and not all parts of the green on this map have the same ecological functions. A floodplain is different than a high elevation montane forest, is different than the edge of a habitat block where there's connectivity. So you have to understand the concept of ecological function. What are the functions that are going on in a particular place? So the ecological function is the degree to which an ecosystem can function under natural processes, allowing all its plants and animals to thrive, reproduce, migrate, and move in response to environmental change. So again, we take this overall map and we have to dig in a little bit to figure out what the functions are, to figure out what associated land management or land use might be appropriate there. Not all parts of the green are equal. So when we think about this ecologically functional landscape, we're talking about intact, connected, and diverse. We need all the parts to be intact. We need them to be connected, and we need the biological diversity of all of the different geological settings and so forth. So intact, connected, and diverse. Now, the design was built at 3 different nested scales. And when you first open Vermont conservation design, you see the landscape scale, that dark green, light green, that's the big picture pattern. And this includes components that I've mentioned before, and I'll get into in the next section in a little bit more detail: interior forest, connectivity, geological diversity, surface waters. But then you can also turn on and understand the natural community scale. Things like natural communities, young and old forests, aquatic habitats, wetlands, grasslands, shrublands, that sort of thing. Or even the species scale, things like rare, threatened, and endangered. So what I think is really helpful for landowners, for municipal volunteers, is this is the way that VCD gives us context. So when we start at this landscape scale, we get a sense, what are the broad patterns of highest priority area across this section of the Upper Valley? And then we can move into a particular town and again, see the pattern, highest priority in dark green and priority in light green. But then we can zoom in even more and begin to see those natural community and species scale components. And then we can zoom into a particular parcel and see and see how these different components play out on the individual parcel scale. So this ecological context is really helpful. It adds to your understanding of your favorite places, your parcel, the places you like to hike, as well as your town and the patterns across your town. And so I think this function of allowing for understanding context is really critically important in terms of an offering of the design. Okay, so that was all about prioritization, thinking about the conservation design as a singular prioritization, understanding that it had different scales, understanding what's new. What kinds of questions are coming up for folks? That was not a rhetorical question.
Feel free to take yourself off mute and just jump in with whatever questions you have. Wheezy, go ahead.
I don't have a question. It's just much clearer to me what the improvements are and how I can use that to really look, for example, the data that you just sent us and really be able to analyze it. I mean, I knew that there was the new added wildlife road crossing data, but it is now clear to me why that's happening and how I can best use it. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, that wildlife crossing data is based. I'll hit this at the end, but it's really based on the proximity of habitat blocks adjacent to the road, and so that's structural connectivity. That's where the structure of that forest on both sides makes a difference. And you all are mapping functional connectivity in Shrewsbury. And so where wildlife, our hypothesis is that structural connectivity leads to functional connectivity. It's easier to map in a more fragmented landscape. But, as you know from like the Cold Hollow Road in Shrewsbury, there are long sections with trees on both sides. The whole thing shows up in Vermont conservation design from a structural standpoint as likely to be a wildlife road crossing. And yet your tracking data shows that there are some places that are more favorable than others. And so that's why there's a discrepancy between the VCD wildlife road crossings and your tracking data. But your data is better. It's real. Our data is a model in this case. Anything else for folks? All right, I'm going to keep going, but don't hesitate to jump in, please. We definitely will have time. Okay. So let's take this singular prioritization and explode it into its parts. And first, we'll talk about the landscape scale components, and then we'll talk about the species and community scale components. So with the landscape scale, I've mentioned before, but that overall ecologically functional landscape and the landscape blocks are really subsets. They're selections of forest blocks that were selected for interior forest, for connectivity, for geological diversity, and then, of course, the surface water and riparian area network. So the design is not an a la carte menu. You can't say, oh, I'll take interior forest, but not surface waters. In our opinion, this is the ecologically functional landscape, and we need it in its entirety. But I will explain how understanding these individual components can help you understand more about the values that add up to that ecologically functional landscape. So that first one is interior forest blocks. And here we're talking about really the largest forest blocks in each region of the state that provide for interior forest condition. So as you look at the map, please understand the Champlain Valley, Middlebury is radically different than the spine of the Greens. There's much more biological diversity in the Champlain Valley, and yet there's the forest blocks tend to be a lot smaller. And so we set different thresholds for what the largest interior forest blocks in the Champlain Valley are versus the spine of the Greens or the Northeast Kingdom. Please also notice that these do not make a connected pattern. These are simply the largest ones. It's also based on core area. So we're trying to prioritize blocks that are a little bit more round, where they're going to have more core in the middle of it. And the long stringy blocks might not even have any core in them at all. The whole thing might be edge. So interior forest blocks is a combination of an acreage threshold and a core forest threshold. Excuse me. So the next component of the design is connectivity. And here we're talking about the network of habitat blocks that promote landscape connectivity across Vermont. And so as you look at this aerial photo, you can see that some of these forests are better connected to one another and are absolutely functioning together. Some of these connections are a little bit more tenuous. But the idea is, what's this backbone of connectivity across Vermont that allows for wildlife movement. And I'm not just talking about wildlife movement in Vermont. I'm talking about connecting the Berkshires and the Taconics and the Adirondacks and the Suttons in Quebec and the White Mountains in New Hampshire. What are the forests in Vermont that allow for that connectivity? So as you look at this map, please understand these do make a connected pattern. So these do share some of the largest, those core forests, those interior forest blocks that I just described. But there are also some smaller stepping stone blocks that were selected as highest priority for connectivity. You'll also see that these areas connect out into the Champlain Valley, Missisquoi, and so forth, to places of diversity in the geological in the geological landscape that I'll explain in a second. So, so connectivity blocks really gets at this backbone of wildlife movement across the whole state. Okay, so geological diversity is a selection of habitat blocks that represents the full range of physical landscape settings. So the physical landscape, geology, slope, aspect, topography. That's the stage. That's the stage that the actors, individual plants and animals, are moving around on. And so we wanted to represent the entire spectrum of physical landscape settings across Vermont, from the top of Mount Mansfield to different settings in the Champlain Valley, you know, clay plain forest or lacustrine settings and so forth. And so we added these. They're not necessarily, they're not all well represented in those selections of interior forest or connectivity. So we went back and added some of the underrepresented settings. Let me give you an example. Calcium. Calcium is an incredibly important nutrient for plant growth. I think 10% of the bedrock in the Northeast is calcium related. And yet Vermont has 50% of that 10%. So we have an abundance of the calcium settings across the Northeast. We have them in Vermont. And so part of what we've done here is overrepresented those calcium-bearing settings as part of our design. So let me just give you a sense of this input data. You know, we looked at land type associations across the state and figured out their relative representativeness, and then ensured that that same level of representation was included in the final design. There's a lot to say here, but I did just want to mention that this is where we get climate resilience. So we're not just looking at current biological diversity, we're looking into the future. Places that have diversity in the physical landscape have biological diversity right now. They're also going to have biological diversity in the future, even as all the plants and animals move around. And so this is how we ensure that we have climate resilience into the future, is by including geological diversity into the design. Surface waters and riparian areas is, again, as I mentioned, this is the complete network of lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams. You can see here that the highest priority area is everything that's intact. The only things we pulled out as priority are locations that are actively developed, parking lots that are right near the stream. And so the overall message is these are still ecologically important. And yet, you know, the suite of management techniques that you use for a parking lot are very different than what you use for you know, functioning riparian area. So we pulled those out. But we really want to underscore this message that everything that's wet is just important for biological diversity. It's important for water quality, flood protection, terrestrial species habitat, wildlife movement, and plant and animal range shifts in response to climate change. Now, there's another related data set here that we call riparian connectivity. And that's a subset of the larger surface water and riparian area network. And that's just the stuff that is currently vegetated. And so you can see that the difference between the surface waters and the riparian areas are places that are developed or are agriculture, and so some of those places are really important for restoration. The riparian connectivity data set really shows places where the aquatic network is linking together terrestrial blocks. That's especially important in the Champlain Valley. That picture that you see at left, you can see a forest linked together by wetland, linking to another forest. And so that network of riparian connectivity connects the blocks, particularly in the more fragmented landscape. So those are the landscape scale components. Now let's just switch gears and think about the community scale components. I'm just going to show you this list. Natural communities, young and old forests, aquatic habitats, vernal pools, wetlands, wildlife road crossings, grasslands and shrublands, underground habitats, and rare, threatened, and endangered species. Now, I don't have time to get into all of these, but here you can think about a lot of these as hotspots of biological diversity. And so in some places, they overlap with that landscape scale network, and they add value to that network. In other places, they fall outside of the network, and they're still incredibly important as a conservation target. So let me just dive into a couple of these. Natural communities. A natural community is an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. This is a shagbark hickory, mesic maple, ash, hickory, oak forest on Snake Mountain. And so you can see where these natural communities, these highest priority natural communities, occur across the state. So we name them based on their common dominant species, but they serve functions that are unique. And so even as the dominant species change, those functions are going to remain. Here's another example, Rock Point in Burlington, limestone bluff cedar pine forest. And again, you can see that one. And so these natural communities, some of them are quite common. For example, Vermont's northern hardwood forest, it's overwhelmingly birch, beech, and maple. And we have huge amounts of it across the state. And yet some of these are quite rare, like this limestone bluff cedar pine forest. And so natural communities is another type of coarse filter that allows us to capture groups of interacting plants and animals in their natural environments. Now, I mentioned wildlife road crossings at the beginning. Some of these are over the road crossings, but some of them are under the road crossings. And so when we think about wildlife road crossing, we're talking about a mix of issues, because for under the road crossings, that brings us to talking about bridges and culverts and flood resiliency and passing floodwater and debris. But at normal flow levels, that appropriately sized culvert is also going to allow for terrestrial movement under the road. So for purposes of BioFinder or Vermont Conservation Design, we made plots. This is a computer model. We made plots on both sides of the road. We assessed the percent of habitat block in each of those plots. And then we were able to flag where there's high percentages of forest on both sides of the road. We were able to flag those as highest priority and priority wildlife road crossings. So again, this is structural connectivity. This is based on the percent of forest on both sides of the road. So again, this concept of wildlife road crossing gets us into all these different overlapping issues. And it's really interesting to me because it's a place where, so far I've really talked about green infrastructure, right? I've talked about large forest blocks. I've talked about surface waters. I've talked about geological diversity. That's green infrastructure. But here we're beginning to think also about gray infrastructure, places where our engineered solutions are actually part of the network of connectivity, allowing for plants, animals, fish to move under the road and to connect habitats. So I'm really interested in this idea of gray and green infrastructure. And I want to explore that a little bit more in a separate webinar we're doing this fall of the same name. Okay, so that was the deep dive into the components, the landscape, the community, and the species scale components. Comments, questions, thoughts? What are you? What's going on for folks?
Weezy, go ahead.
Oh, I guess I still had my mic on. I don't have any questions. It's a really good review for me and
Awesome.
clarification. So
Cool.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. For the new member who joined us during the last segment, we have a couple sections where we pause for a break and questions. So feel free to unmute yourself, or you can also write a question in the chat or use the raise hand feature. And anyone who's been present the whole time, this is an opportunity for you to comment or question. And we threw a lot of data, a lot of information at you.
All right, Dave, do you want to switch over and take over?
Yeah, absolutely. Are you seeing my screen, Jens?
Good to go.
All right, perfect. Okay, folks, so we've given you a lot to think about, a lot of information and how these layers break down all the complex things that went into putting together Vermont conservation design. And so part of the point of creating Vermont conservation design is to put that data into your hands so that you can apply it on the town level. And so we want to end the webinar today by thinking about the town scale, the municipal sphere, where we really make a lot of the decisions around land use and conservation in our state. Now, Jens mentioned that Vermont conservation design is not a la carte. We really need all these different components working together to create the ecologically functional landscape. But we don't necessarily need to be doing everything everywhere all at once. Right? Jens also mentioned that the ecological functions that are represented in our landscape really do differ from area to area. Some parts of the landscape are providing really important connectivity functions, while other parts are providing more of those interior forest functions, for example. So we want to have a good sense of both the patterns in our overall priorities and also where these functions are on the landscape, so that we can take local actions that also connect us beyond our town boundaries to an overall statewide coordination. And that's where Vermont conservation design really shines, is in its ability to connect us beyond town boundaries to this broader vision and really help us kind of fulfill the state motto, right? We have freedom to make the important decisions in the local sphere, but also present a kind of unity in coordinating beyond boundaries and recognizing and validating these statewide patterns. So as a statewide prioritization, we can really think of Vermont conservation design as facilitating coordinating effort between all different levels of organizations, state government agencies, down to conservation nonprofits, municipalities, volunteer and local action groups, and even down to the level of individual landowners who are trying to understand how their parcel of land that they're interested in stewarding fits into a bigger picture. All right, now when we start to think about applying Vermont conservation design at a town level, I want to give you a quick roadmap for how you can use it. And the first step is always to understand the larger context of the town or the area that you're working in. And to do that, we want to start with the overall priorities at the landscape level. We'll take a look at some examples of these in a little bit. Now, after we've looked at the overall priorities, the areas of the landscape where Vermont activity blocks, the geological diversity blocks, so we can understand which ecological functions are present in which areas that are bringing that pattern together. The next step is to go to the smaller scale. Vermont Conservation Design community and species level components, those elements that Jens discussed that tend to be more specific, are hotspots of biodiversity, our natural communities, our wetlands, our rare species populations, right? We want to get all of those into our planning process. And it's important to acknowledge that Vermont Conservation Design, as something that's been mapped at a statewide scale, does have limitations. And when we're engaging in town level conservation planning work, we really want to draw upon local knowledge and local inventories that have been done that tend to use a more detailed resolution in terms of identifying features. So we want to bring in all the information, but the VCD community and species level components is really a great place to start and is going to draw our attention to many of the most important areas within any given town. Now, once we have all of that information, it's easy to recognize patterns and it's easy to see hotspots that need protection. And so we can take local action. But I want to draw our attention to an important difference, which is that when we're thinking on a landscape level, so maybe we're looking at an interior forest block, or we're looking at areas that Vermont Conservation Design has flagged as connectivity blocks. The most important thing to understand there is Vermont Conservation Design isn't saying, hey, this whole block is off limits to people. It's saying there's an important pattern here and we need to preserve that pattern. So we want to take actions that help us preserve that pattern. For example, with an interior forest block, we're going to want to avoid any kind of development in our town that fragments that interior forest block, because that would destroy the pattern and the ecological function. And instead, we might want to think, okay, well, this is an area where maybe we can concentrate some sustainable development activities around the edges, or the outside of this interior forest block, because that still preserves the pattern. On the other hand, when we look at the community and species level components, these tend to be areas that are less flexible to accommodate different kinds of human uses. Populations of rare and uncommon species, for example, we're going to want to be very sensitive about how we protect those. And we might require more detailed or slightly more strict protections in how we think about interacting with those components of the landscape. All right, now Vermont Conservation Design is available to everyone to view on BioFinder website. I'll see an example of that in a little bit. But when you look at the data, one of the first things you're going to notice is that we use 2 levels of priority to rank all the different ecological features and the overall priorities. So the 2 levels are highest priority and priority. And then, of course, there's a 3rd level, which is it wasn't flagged at all in the conservation design. And so it's helpful to understand what these priorities really are telling us. So highest priority is generally telling us, okay, this feature is contributing to the most to meeting whatever particular key function we're discussing. So this feature is contributing the most to connectivity on a statewide scale. That's a highest priority feature. On the other hand, priority features tend to be serving supporting roles. So if we have a priority interior forest block, it might be saying, okay, in the local landscape, there are other places that serve the highest priority functions. But this forest block is also important. It's supporting that function and it's providing a safety buffer by planning for redundancy in important landscape features. So if we were to lose one of these forest blocks for various reasons, we can look to those priority features. They might become more important in the future. Now, one of the things you're going to notice is that this dark green highest priority covers a very large swath of the state. So again, it's important to recognize that these features that are highlighted in Vermont Conservation Design are not being highlighted to send the message, hands off, we can't go there, we can't interact with these, we can't develop our communities in ways that we need to. What they're trying to do is draw our attention to make us think harder about how we can balance the needs of our communities in terms of economics and sustainable development with maintaining the patterns and protecting the hotspots. So we're going to notice in just a second that some places are going to have so much dark green, right, that it becomes less helpful. Whereas other towns in the local context, the amount of highest priority habitat is going to be very limited, and that's going to really draw our attention to certain areas. So let's close out with a little bit of a side-by-side comparison. I want to look at two different towns that we selected at semi-random, but we selected them because they have a very big difference in terms of what Vermont conservation design is telling us about those towns and how we can interpret that information to make decisions on a local scale. So we're going to compare Addison in Western Vermont and Stratford in the East. So here we have a snapshot of BioFinder. The BioFinder website will provide a link to that at the end in the chat. It's a free mapping tool that you can go online and you can turn on and off all these different Vermont conservation design layers. And we recommend that you do. It's an excellent tool. So if you zoom into a town, here we are in Addison. Remember that the first step with using Vermont conservation design is always to look at the highest level, which is the landscape scale and the overall priorities for the species and community scale. So here we have those overall priorities, dark green, some little splashes of priority in the lime green, and also you can see in purple our species and community scale overall priorities. So we can immediately get a sense that, okay, the context of this town is one that has had a very agricultural history. There's been lots of land clearing, and it's very fragmented in terms of the habitat blocks and features that remain. All right, now let's compare this with a different town. Let's go to Stratford in the East. And you can probably immediately tell that this is a very different context. We have more mountainous terrain, it's higher elevation, and the main thing is it's largely forested, right? If we look at this on a town level scale, we can say, oh my gosh, it's all green. So the decisions that we make and the way that we use Vermont conservation design data is really going to differ. In a town like Stratford, we might be looking at those priority blocks in lime green to say, okay, well, these are areas, because there's so much highest priority forest here, maybe we're going to look at those priority areas as areas that might accommodate more of the different kinds of land uses that we need to develop our town in a sustainable fashion and to provide the services that people need. Whereas if we go back to Addison, we might see, okay, there's very little highest priority or priority features here, or at least less. And so all of those are going to serve a more important purpose. All right, now back to Addison. After we've looked at the overall priorities, we want to break it down into its components. So we can look at the interior forest blocks here in dark purple and light purple. We can see that we have one very large, still intact forest block, or large in comparison to the surrounding smaller fragmented blocks. So it's going to be very important to protect that. But we also see that we have this patchwork of riparian connectivity features that are going to provide different functions that will be important to pay attention to. Here's connectivity blocks, so highlighting again that same patch of forest, which I believe is the Snake Mountain area. And our riparian connectivity, so we can start to break out the different functions that the overall priorities was highlighting. And once we've looked at the landscape scale thoroughly, we can bring in the finer scale. We can look at the community level scale components, the species scale components, and this is going to draw our attention to different things, protecting those hotspots. So right in the center of our screen here, we can see this little fragmented parcel of forest. On a landscape scale, that might not be serving a very large purpose. But on a community scale, if we understand that, okay, that small fragment of forest has very old and mature red maple trees that are providing habitat for roosting federally endangered Indiana bat. Well, suddenly that small fragment becomes very important to protect. And especially in a town where the context like Addison is fragmentary, agricultural, we might be looking at these small fragments and saying, hey, actually, there's a story here. These fragments connect together to provide connectivity across this landscape. So this hedgerow here and this small fragment of forest here, they're actually very important on our local scale, even though they weren't flagged at the statewide priority scale by Vermont Conservation Design. To bring us back to this comparison, we can return to Stratford and see sort of an opposite context and say, okay, well here, the highest priority green is not necessarily helping us to the same degree to highlight different areas of the landscape that might need more protections versus others. So we might need to really turn to that community and species level scale to understand, where are the hot spots? Are there areas of this landscape that we might prioritize over others based on different ecological conditions? And how can that help us make decisions on the town-wide scale? Because remember, green and Vermont conservation design doesn't mean humans aren't welcome. It doesn't mean we can't develop the things that we need there. It means we have to be sensitive to patterns and extra thoughtful about how we develop those areas and how we accommodate both the human uses that we need and preserving the patterns for this statewide, larger scale ecological function that we're trying so hard to preserve. And at the end of the day, that's really what this tool is about. It's about giving us the information we need to execute this challenging balancing act that all of us are involved in conservation to see at the end of the day. We want healthy forests. We know we also want healthy economies and healthy communities so our towns can be vibrant, so that resources we have can be accessed by all, and we can really see the Vermont that we want to see moving forward, even as climate change changes some of these factors. All right, so to close out, we'll take a moment for any questions. I also want to direct your attention to some resources we have for you, and we'll place these in the chat. Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage is a guidebook on how to use BioFinder and access the Vermont conservation design data. It's an online free guidebook. The BioFinder website is that mapping tool I mentioned where you can see and play around with all this data. And we also have a story map, What is Vermont Conservation Design, which is meant to be a review for you, and actually going in a little more detail on some of these components that we talked about today. So we'll share all those links with you. And we'd like to close out by taking an opportunity for questions here, and thank you for joining us.
Go ahead, Linda.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to say that this is the second time that I've watched this presentation. And as you say, it's a whole lot of information to cover, but I got a lot out of it the second time. And I think it's important now that I go to the website and play around with the maps. And so thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for staying with us, Linda. And when you explore BioFinder, just remember, you can't break it. So just go for it. Click around with reckless abandon. It really doesn't matter. And that hopefully will make it a little easier to just explore the website.
Okay. And one thing I did have trouble with was after I had made like a little map was how to save it.
Yeah, you have to export it. You have to print it as a PDF. That's how you save it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Anyone else? Wheezy, do you have any questions or comments?
Again, I ditto Linda. I mean, I've heard this many times, but it is just finally sinking in. Slow studies here, but we're getting it. I have a comment when you when you were talking about different ways to apply VCD, and you got to the fourth stage of taking local action, which is kind of where we're at, about to be at, and that's why I think Linda just sent you another request. We are really hoping to have a map of our town's zoning overlay map of connectivity overlaid with the data, so we could really now use BioFinder, I hope, more effectively to really pinpoint differences that we see in our data and the town zoning map.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and I have that data, and I can absolutely make that map. I actually had it open to do it just before this webinar, so that's easy to do. But I can also send you that overlay district as a zip file, and you can bring it into BioFinder. So you can look at that at the same time.
You make that sound really easy.
We have a step-by-step instructions for upload. It's called uploading a shapefile. And we have a step-by-step instruction. It's not a big deal.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yep, will do.
Well, thank you for all the work you do.
You're welcome.
And I,
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Weezy. And I also love that as an example of a tool that you highlighted, zoning overlays, which could be used to potentially preserve a pattern. And that's really, what the message we're trying to send is the way that you interact with data on a landscape level scale is you're trying to preserve the pattern, but you can still accommodate a certain amount of different uses. Whereas things on the species and community level scale tend to be more sensitive and might require a little stricter protection.
All right, I think we're good here. Feel free to email us if any other questions or comments come up, and I'll be in touch with you folks in Shrewsbury with that next map. I should be able to turn that around pretty quick. Have a great day, everyone. Really good to hear from you, and thanks so much for tuning in. Take care, Dave.
Thanks, folks. Bye, Jens.